There's only one scenario, other than an asteroid strike, that could end the world as we know it in a matter of hours: nuclear war. And one of the triggers for that war would be a nuclear missile inbound toward the United States. Thank you for joining me on the JACK CARR Book Club, and this journey in particular with Annie Jacobsen and her new book, Nuclear War, A Scenario. Annie is the author of multiple books in the national security space, Pulitzer Prize finalist, and I'm honored to have her as the first guest on my book club. Annie Jacobsen. Annie, how are you? But thank you so much for writing this book. I mean, my goodness. Read the whole thing, digested it, spent a lot of time in it, because these days with all the research, and I want to ask you about your research, I read things very quickly these days because there's so much going on. I did not read this quickly. I sat down and no distractions, no phone, no computer, and every single word, and read it the way that I used to read before everything got so busy. So of course that was enjoyable, but reading this, of course, makes me want to even go through all my prepper nature and refine things a little more. But before we get to that though, path into writing and becoming an author, because this is a podcast about books, reading and research and writing. What was your path to becoming an author?
So I recall you and I talking about this before, and I love this concept because for me, I am one of those people who always knew they were a writer. The dream was to become an author, but anybody can be a writer, and that's how you start. Pick up the pen and write. Guess what? You are now a writer. And I went off to a boarding school when I was 15 years old with a typewriter, desiring to be a writer and intending to be a writer and learning the craft of writer. And all these decades later, here I am now, 7 books.
7 books, which I do have right here for those Pulitzer Prize finalists. And look at all of those right there. We talked about these last time, and this is amazing. I'll get to it in a little bit, but all this research that went into these books seemed to have really helped with this, especially with people you interviewed in the past who have since passed away because they were around for the beginnings, essentially, of the nuclear age. But when you're not reading or researching a project, when you just sit down to read something for the sheer magic and enjoyment of it, what are you reading?
Oh my goodness. I mean, I read such a wide variety of subject matters, and I read all different formats, long form, short form. There is value in reading, shall we say, Twitter or, social media that you referenced earlier, because that gives me ideas of what I want to read, how I want to read, and why I want to read. I'll give you an example of what's on my bedside table. There is a book, which I am now completely forgetting the title of, which is about the history of the Earth from a geological perspective, written by a Harvard professor. The beauty of a book like that, I wanted to say it's called The History of the Earth, is that it's little, it's short, it's digestible. It's written by one of the smartest people in the world on the subject, and yet he knows how to write to laymen of geology, somebody like me. And that kind of thinking about deep time, long time, gives me extraordinary perspective, certainly writing something like Nuclear War, where civilization might end. I also read science fiction. I'm a strange reader in that I sometimes read books twice in a row, because if I really like a book, I will read it the first time for that kind of experience, the newness of entering into someone else's world. And then I want to know how they did it. So I read it again, like a dissecting,
Right.
what tools did they use? How did they align their chapters? Um, so I think there's so much to be learned from reading books for so many different reasons, endlessly.
And it's not surprising to me that that's on your bedside table because of the way you finish
Mm.
this book, how you finish Nuclear War, A Scenario. So that does not surprise me at all. And I'm going to actually look that book up and get it
I'm
as
gonna
well. because a lot of times those kind of books start with, and first the earth cooled, and you have to kind of you have to get going a little bit before you get to the meat
Exactly.
of it.
And by the way, the earth cooling is like chapter 3 or 4 in that 10 chapter book
Oh
because
wow.
it begins, it begins way back, billions of
Yeah.
years ago. I'm going to send you the book because I'm so embarrassed that I
Thank you.
didn't.
No, I'm going to pick it up for sure. And what's the first book you remember reading as a child?
So that's a funny question. I love your questions, Jack. They're very unique. So my parents were big readers
Mhm.
and they had libraries like I had behind me, like you have. My parents were both educators, like yours. And there were always these very thick books with long titles that were incomprehensible to a young, let's say, first grader like myself when I was just learning how to read properly. So the first, I, I would do something like look at the bookshelves, memorize the name titles, and then go to the library in the small town I lived in Connecticut and ask the librarian, I'd like a copy, please, of the Brothers Karamazov.
Mhm.
And as a first grader, of course, I
Yeah.
could not read it. I had no idea what that was, but I wanted to. I look back on my childhood self, and I think I just wanted to impress the librarian that I could read and could read really complicated things. That's my first memory. I
Oh
don't think I
wow.
read Brothers Karamazov for another 10 years.
Right, right. And was there a book around, let's say, fifth grade, sixth grade, seventh grade, when typically people are transitioning over from those young adult books onto the same type of books that we read and write
Mhm.
today, adult fiction or non? Is there a book back then or a short story that you remember making an impact on you that inspired you to become
Mhm.
a writer or encouraged you down that path earlier on?
I remember precisely the first person who impacted me deeply, and it wasn't until I was in high school. And I was a sophomore in high school, and I had a teacher called Mr. Katzenberg, and he taught us American literature. And I remember reading Catch 22, and I remember reading Slaughterhouse Five. And I remember being introduced to concepts about about the military industrial complex, about America, about pulling back the veil and seeing the absurdity in subjects that were not normally presented as absurd.
Mhm.
And I remember, and when I say absurd, I mean like almost surreal in their complexity. And that impacted me so profoundly. I owe a lot of my trajectory to Mr. Katzenberg.
Oh, wow. And for this book, were there, let's say, two or three titles of other books that you researched nuclear war that laid part of this foundation, other than the work and interviews that you'd already done over the past years for previous books and articles? Were there a couple books that you
Yeah.
read, whether they were memoirs or there were books just about nuclear war, nuclear weapons in general? Were there a couple that stand out to you as some that you would recommend to people who read nuclear war scenario if they want to know a little bit more? What were some of those?
And I mention these in my bibliography, but what comes to mind is like the John Hersey Hiroshima,
Right.
which was the first account of the physical horrors of nuclear weapons on humans. And also The Wizards of Armageddon by Fred Kaplan, which was the
Right.
first expose into the plannings, the machinations of man's mind, of how to then fight and win a nuclear war, which
Yeah.
is such an absurd concept and underpins my book. And it was great to interview Fred Kaplan. He's a real giant in this business.
I just got to meet him at the 100th anniversary of Simon and Schuster about a month ago. I went out there and was asked to speak, which was a huge honor. So I got to speak, and I mean, Woodward was there. It was amazing. Jerry Seinfeld kicked it off because he published a book with Simon and Schuster. But I got to meet Fred Kaplan then as well, and I'd used his books for my book that's coming out, Red Sky Morning. I used two of his books in the research for that. But I want to dive in to nuclear war. Thank you so much for taking the time because I know you have been talking about this endlessly. And this book, congratulations, it is multiple weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. Amazing. Let me just read the beginning here, this prologue, for people that are not familiar with your work or this work in particular here. A 1 megaton thermonuclear weapon detonation begins with a flash of light and heat so tremendous it is impossible for the human mind to comprehend. 180 million degrees Fahrenheit is 4 or 5 times hotter than the temperature that occurs at the center of the Earth's sun. In the first fraction of a millisecond after this thermonuclear bomb strikes the Pentagon outside Washington, D.C., there's a light, soft X-ray light, which is very short wavelength. The light superheats the surrounding air to millions of degrees, creating a massive fireball that expands at millions of miles per hour. Within a few seconds, this fireball increases to diameter of a little more than a mile. Its light and heat so intense that concrete surfaces explode, metal objects melt or evaporate, stone shatters, humans instantaneously convert into combusting carbon. The 5-story, 5-sided structure of the Pentagon and everything inside its 6.5 million square feet of office space explodes into superheated dust from the initial flash of light and heat, all the walls shattering with a near simultaneous arrival of the shock wave, all 27,000 employees perishing instantly. Not a single thing in the fireball remains. Nothing. Ground zero is zeroed. And that's how this book kicks off right here. What sparked your interest in this? Was it previous work that you'd already done? And also the way that you do it, a scenario different from your other books and fascinating.
Yes. Jack, I've been reporting on nuclear weapons since my very first book, Area 51, which, of course, is a military facility inside what used to be the Nevada Test and Training Range, where over 100 atmospheric nuclear weapons tests took place starting in the 1950s, which the Defense Department chronicled down to minutia, which I use as details to what happens to people and objects in nuclear blasts. And I've, touched upon nuclear issues in all of my book. In Surprise, Kill, Vanish, my main character, Billy Waugh, was part of a absolutely top tier elite team of special forces operators, CIA operators who actually practiced halo jumping a portable nuclear weapon into the Nevada test site and then watched it explode. And so all of the books in between include sources who have said to me with great pride that they did what they did to prevent nuclear World War III. You asked how the book began. Well, during the previous administration, when former President Trump was in office, this rhetoric that was coming out of his mouth, the fire and fury rhetoric about, sort of threatening nuclear war with North Korea, to my eye and to many of people that I interview in the national security apparatus, this was aberrant presidential behavior. This is not something that a U.S. president should be threatening. And I was alarmed, as were many people, including directors of Stratcom, former directors who were going to Congress and discussing this issue. And so I think there was kind of a collective moment among many Americans, certainly me, where I wondered what would happen if deterrence failed. This idea that we can prevent nuclear World War III by having a massive arsenal of nuclear weapons.
Mhm.
And that was a question that I put to all of my sources, which is how the reporting began. And as for the ticking time clock scenario, once I learned how nuclear war unfolds, which surprised even me, that this is something that is known in seconds and minutes. Then the way in which to report the book, the form in which to tell the book, to tell it as a scenario, to tell it in seconds and minutes became really obvious.
Oh yeah, that was genius as I started going because I mean, unput downable is a little bit overused when you're doing a blurb, but for sure, especially this format, you are not putting this thing down. You are reading it all the way through. It's almost like 24. That was new at the time when that show debuted in 2001,
Mm-hmm.
and people were enthralled by it. And that ticking clock right there, I think it was ticking down, but this one obviously is moving forward. But also interesting when you talk about the rhetoric, you take it one step further, and it's really the second and third order effects. And I don't want to give away what happens here near the end, but there's something unanticipated that happens that escalates everything. And I thought that was something that I had not considered. That's near the end of the book, and everyone read this thing through, listen to it. And do you narrate this one also?
I do. I narrate all my books.
That's incredible. I mean, I outsourced that to Ray Porter for sure. I tried to do a prologue once to a new or a new preface or a forward. Yeah, I added a forward to the terminal list that was a special media tie-in for the show, and me just talking about how the book and the show came to be. So it was just something I'd written,
Yeah.
30 minutes before, and just me in my voice, no accents, no other people. That was so difficult. I vowed never to do that again. So hat off to you for doing it for all these books, and you have a great voice for it as well. I stumble around, and you're so good at that. But what was declassified for this book? That was enthralling from the beginning as well, and I know what it is because I've read the whole thing, and I get to it farther on in the book. But what was declassified for this book, and why do you think they declassified it now?
So the football is the president's emergency satchel that goes around with him 24/7, 365 days a year. People who know about the football, and now your listeners can look at photographs of the president, or more appropriately, video, and you can eventually identify the military aide known as the mill aide carrying this very heavy suitcase, or it's about this big, and inside of that there are, it's shorthanded to say the nuclear codes, but I really drill down on it as the black book and the identification factors for the president. And the origin story of the football was declassified for me by Los Alamos, which was fascinating for a number of reasons. Most importantly to me, having to do with transparency and kind of this necessary movement, or rather bridge building between the nuclear labs, the military, and American citizens, the citizens of the world, who really would be wise to consider what nuclear war would look like right now, and why it is so threatening, and why it is so dangerous, and why we must reverse course on the direction in which we're going. And that transparency was indicated to me by Los Alamos declassifying this. I asked them that question, Jack, because I was surprised, having reported on nuclear weapons since Area 51, going back to 2009. I'd been to the lab several times, been to the archives, worked to get things declassified, and I'd always gotten what I felt was a little bit of a distancing, oh, you're a national security journalist and we're the lab. So there was a reticence, shall we say.
Yeah.
And this time there was a reciprocity. Why, I asked. And I was told by one of the lab historians that it was the Oppenheimer effect.
Uh,
Me and the film, not the
mhm.
person, meaning Christopher Nolan's film Oppenheimer was so profoundly impactful that it caused people, not just in the United States, but around the world, media outlets, to contact the lab with requests. And the lab, at least this is what the historian told me, felt compelled to meet the public at their request. And
Wow.
I thought that is a really interesting trend in the right direction.
Wow. Oliver Stone's JFK did something similar. We passed a law in Congress declassifying documents from the Kennedy assassination all those years later, which we have now passed. And administrations are now seem to be in violation of that law created because of that film. So popular culture, in effect, can have this impact on us as a nation, which seems like what happened here with
I had no idea that was an Oliver Stone JFK film impact.
Oh
Wow,
yeah.
what an interesting detail.
Yep, and interesting that we still don't have those all those documents
Right,
declassified.
that they can push back against it. Like, okay,
It
great, the
is.
law that's
Yeah,
passed, but dot dot
right.
dot. This is
It's
still a
amazing.
national security issue. We cannot tell you.
It's incredible.
Wow.
Multiple administrations across parties, and yeah, that's an interesting one. So the most surprising thing you learn, because there's so much in this book, every chapter has something in it, every new timeline, every new perspective has something new in it that I didn't know before. And you've done so much research in all these other books that you've done. What was the most surprising thing to you having this fairly robust foundation because of all your previous research?
Well, I, like you, had that feeling every second of every minute that I was reporting, literally.
Mhm.
But I'm going to say the first and most impactful one was probably what happens in the first second, because once you understand what happens in the first second, that it happens in the first second, and that there is no turning back,
Yeah.
then if you're hopefully a reader, you feel compelled to read the book. And if you're a reporter, you know you have to write the book to the end. And the end, by the way, spoiler alert, is nuclear Armageddon. Not only that, but after 72 minutes. So in the first second, the United States Defense Department knows that a ballistic missile is coming in the first second. This is not a 9/11 scenario whereby the towers have just been struck by one or two airplanes, and you have the president of the United States having an aide whisper in his ear, "Sir," we all know that image, that video. Um, After the first plane hit is when the president learned of 9/11. Wow, nuclear war is not that. A system has been set up whereby a satellite parked over an adversary nation that could launch a nuclear missile detects the launch in the first fraction of a second.
Yeah.
That missile cannot be redirected or recalled. Now we know. No wonder it's endgame.
Yeah. And going back to that black book that you talked about and the football and the menu of options and our counterparts having something similar in place, that part was fascinating. Although not surprising that the President of the United States does not typically have a full understanding of what these options are, what the
Mhm.
consequences are, what these contingencies could be, thinking through second and third order effects of these decisions. I should say that that part was not surprising, just having a couple touch points with people in those spheres. Unfortunately, did you know of Bolt out of the blue attack before you started writing, or was that something you discovered for this book?
It's definitely something I discovered for this book. And again, when that comes to you, that kind of information comes to you from someone who used to advise the president, it is pretty stunning. And a bolt out of the blue attack for listeners is a rogue nation or any nuclear armed nation suddenly launching a nuclear missile at Washington, D.C. And the quote was that a bolt out of the blue attack is what Washington fears most. Um, that was from Andrew Weber, who was the deputy director for chemical, nuclear, and biological issues for the president of the United States. And
Oh,
so to think that there are individuals in Washington that fear this should never be taken lightly.
oh yeah. And who is John H. Rubel? I hope I'm saying that
Mm,
right. You start
yeah.
off the book talking about him, and he was someone in that room for that 1960 plan for general nuclear war, who then starts talking about it in his 80s.
It's so interesting that, and you know this from your work, that the national security apparatus is such a tightly knit community, and it is so entwined with significantly important concepts of patriotism, of the good kind of nationalism, of national security, of love of country, of duty to job. You know this. I know this. We respect this. Where it becomes complicated and perhaps even more important in the modern world in which technology is moving faster than we as humans are, is when individuals with a deep former need to know on classified projects feel compelled to share what they know in a general way with the public without, violating their security clearances. That is this difficult line to watch. You're taught when you reference John Rubel, he's certainly one of those individuals, a rare individual from the old days, from the Cold War warrior early days. Rubel was in the room when the original nuclear war plan called the PSYOP was created for the president in 1960. And Rubel sat there at a meeting where he learned that in a preemptive attack against the Soviet Union, 600 million people would be killed, essentially instantly. And as you mentioned, not until he was in his 80s, around 2007, 2008, did John Rubel reveal this information. And it was the first time that an insider not only spoke on the record about this, very classified scenario, but he spoke about how he felt as if it was a matter of the heart, which it is. And there, I think your reaction to that was certainly like my reaction, and hopefully like readers' reactions, where you realize how complex of an issue this is. You have a dedicated civil servant who, in Rubel's case, he's about to meet his maker, suddenly realizes, and as he tells us in his memoir that I quote, he felt that he was participating in a plan for mass extermination. Those are his words.
Yeah, it's so powerful. Another person that stands out, who I think you brought up in previous books, but Klaus, I don't know how to say his name right, Fuchs, who I looked up. I was curious what he looked like, and so for those watching or listening, he was a spy, and he gave the information to the Soviet Union that allowed them to create their own nuclear weapons program. But he looks like a spy at a central casting. Those black and white photos, I was immediately suspicious. I don't know if I would have been if I hadn't known ahead of time that he was actually a spy. But when you came across him in your research or for previous books, I mean, the impact that one person like that has. I mean, eventually they probably would have had other people that would have given him that information, but maybe not at that. Maybe it would have been a few years later. Maybe things would have been different. So for me, it just stood out as one person in the world of espionage and intelligence services who can really change the course of history.
And for listeners who aren't familiar with Klaus Fuchs, he stole the plans of the atomic bomb out of the Manhattan Project and delivered it to his Soviet handlers. He was a German-born British spy. And of course, the Manhattan Project had borrowed some people from the UK to help, and that were, necessarily brilliant. But he was a secret communist. And so his thinking was that it would be wise to give the technology to the Soviet Union after World War II because it would somehow, keep the powers in balance. And instead, it was the absolute spark of this mad race for nuclear weapons that ultimately ended in 70,000 nuclear warheads. It's fascinating to me, too, that Fuchs wasn't, that his penalty was so low. He was just put in prison. I mean, it was, and the Rosenbergs were executed, and their degree of espionage is still debated. There is no debate about Klaus Fuchs.
Yeah, I was surprised too because I looked, what happened to him? Where was he in prison? Was he executed? Was there some sort of a finding, or was he exiled to Moscow or Soviet Union? He was living in East Germany, and he goes and continues with his work essentially. It was amazing. Till early 80s, he passed away, I think, but he was in the 70s. He was still doing that work behind the Iron Curtain.
And it's such a cautionary tale for today because when you have, intellectual property theft, which that was, it was literally like he had the plans and he gave them to Stalin. And that resulted in 1949, the Russians had the bomb.
Mhm.
And that is a serious thing to consider. When I was working with the nuclear weapons engineers on the Area 51 book, and these are the people who armed, wired, and fired the nuclear atmospheric weapons for the United States, they couldn't leave the United States ever. And they had handlers watching them all the time. They had security kind of in the wings because, and this goes until like, late into the 2000s until they died, because they knew about the triggering devices, which is what most nations, once you have the ability to have a triggering device, the rest is easy.
Wow. And when you came across 1952, the super, the
Mm,
people just throw around nuclear bomb, thermonuclear bomb, but there's some differences between those
yes.
two. And
Yes.
did that
Well, for
shock you how large of a difference that was?
I knew that is one area of nuclear weaponry that I was familiar with from my earlier reporting, particularly in Area 51. But the details that came to me were remarkable for one highlighted reason, and that is because I was able to interview Richard Garwin, who, if you look at the cover of the nuclear war book,
Mhm.
that thermonuclear weapon exploding is the 10.4 megaton Ivy Mike. It's the first thermonuclear device ever exploded in 1952. So for listeners, Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. In essence, that is 1,000 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs going off at the same time. And I interviewed Richard Garwin, who drew the plans for that bomb. Edward Teller is often cited as the father of the thermonuclear weapon, a weapon so powerful it uses an atomic bomb as its triggering device. But Teller could only theoretically conceive of it. He couldn't make it actually explode back in 1952. The job went to Richard Garwin, who was like 23 or 24 years old at the time. He figured it out. Now, this information was also classified until only a few years ago. So if you look at books that were written about the thermonuclear weapon, including one that won the Pulitzer Prize, Garwin is not yet mentioned because his information was classified. It gives you an indication of how many layers of the story get unveiled.
No, it's incredible. And I love how you're doing this minute by minute, second by second approach, but you're also going back and revisiting history in between some of these chapters. And one of the characters that we get to know is General David M. Shoup, a
Mm.
Marine, a Medal of Honor recipient. And what a interesting character. And I was surprised that I had not come across him in my readings up to this point. So I looked him up, looked at what he did over the course of his lifetime. Absolutely incredible. But can you tell us a little bit about why you included him in the book and what he said?
I love that you mentioned this, Jack. And my 19-year-old son, Jet, just came home from college last night and he was reading the book on the airplane. He's like, Mom, Shoup, oh my God, because this is a great point that you want, if you are a journalist, you want to point out the good guys. You want to point out, and when I say good guys, what I mean is a man of deep moral character in a time of intense scrutiny. Shoup was in that room that we referred to a moment ago, the story of John Rubel, in the room when the PSYOP, the plan for general nuclear war that was going to kill 1/5 of the people on the planet across the world in a preemptive strike if the United States went ahead and did that. And at the time, before the PSYOP, which was essentially the single integrated operational plan, that's what it stands for, that was a plan to give the president the authority, and only the president the authority, to launch nuclear weapons. Before that, as astonishing as it may seem, all of the military establishments had their own arsenal of nuclear weapons. This is like that they could use at their own discretion. It's stunning that this was going on in the 50s. The exception was the Marine Corps, and Shoup was the commandant of the Marine Corps. Shoup had won the Medal of Honor in World War II. And so, interestingly, the point of that, I think, which you hit upon, certainly my son hit upon reading it, was like, okay, so the one military leader who doesn't essentially have a horse in the race, mean budget wise, he has no nuclear arsenal at his disposal. He's the only guy in the room that speaks up and says, killing 600 million people on the other side of the world is not the American way.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's enough to give any of us pause. Because, and again, before we get self righteous,
Right.
I think it's worth examining what's in the mirror, right? You want to stop and say, what would I do? What would I do? Not that I would ever be the, leader of the Air Force, the commander of the Army, but imagine yourself in the shoes of someone who is, and then it's valuable, I think, on a character on a character questioning situation where you wonder what is, wait a minute, you double check yourself, like, how am I making my decisions and
Yeah.
why?
Yeah, I always try to look at things through the lens of the time in which they were written or the decision was made in order to give it its proper context. But yeah, that's wow. Yeah, he stood out to me as someone I want to certainly
Yes.
learn more about. And then 26 minutes and 40 seconds. Herb York left us with
Mhm.
this. Can you talk about 26 minutes and 40
Yeah.
seconds?
Sometimes, as you know, I'm sure from all the books you have written, sometimes a detail in an earlier book makes its way in an important way into a later book. And that is certainly the situation with me and with Herb York. Herb York was the first director of DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, arguably the most powerful. Actually, I don't even think you can argue this. It is the most powerful, the most secretive military research agency in the world. And I wrote a book about it called The Pentagon's Brain. And when I was beginning to report that book, I was wondering how I was going to bring new information to the table that wasn't just the declassified documents. Of course, a reporter is going to find sources, but a reporter is also going to look to the archives, the personal archives of the individuals involved. I learned that trick from other journalists, that a lot of times people leave information, they'll leave their entire library to such and such archive at such and such university. And that was the case with Herb York. It was right here in San Diego, down the road. I live in Los Angeles. So I went down to look at York's papers, and they were like, talk about a dusty archive. I mean, I felt like I was the first person who had ever looked at these. And in those papers, I found a report that York saved, which I could not get this answer from the Defense Department. It's a really simple answer. It's a really simple question, which is this: how long does it take for an ICBM to get from a launch pad in Russia to a target on the East Coast of the United States? I asked that question of the Defense Department, of DOE. No one would answer. Just, I wanted it actually an official answer. I found it in York's papers because York asked that question in the 1950s. And he called upon the Jason scientists, about whom multiple conspiracies have been written. They were kind of like the supermen of science, still are. They advised the Pentagon. But York hired the Jason scientists and asked them to whittle that number down to seconds. And the answer he came up with was 1,600 seconds. That's your 26 minutes and 40 seconds. And
So
maybe it's worth just giving listeners a quick, because this kind of simplicity, I think, helps people conceptualize why nuclear war happens and, begins and ends in 72 minutes. That 26 minutes and 40 seconds of the ballistic missile happens in three simple phases. Boost phase, when the rockets ignite for 5 minutes only. The rocket is gaining altitude and can be seen by a satellite. Then there is the 20-minute period in mid-course phase, sort of when it's arcing over the Earth, heading to the target using gravity. at, 500 miles above the earth, at something like Mach 23, 20 minutes, and then the final 100 seconds, 1.6 minutes, where it enters terminal phase and the warhead detonates on the target. That is stunning.
Amazing. And the launch on warning policy, that was something I hadn't heard phrased like that before. Bush, Obama, Biden all said this is something that they would change. It was a policy that they would change. And then they did not. Why not, do you think?
That is a good question. That is a question I would love the answer to. It is a mystery. No president will say why they have not gotten rid of launch on warning, which is exactly like it sounds, that when the United States Defense Department learns a ballistic missile is on its way to the United States, they begin the process of a counterattack with nuclear weapons to decimate the nation crazy enough to have launched on the United States.
And this isn't a calm, cool, collected few minutes, as you describe in the novel second, or in the book, second by second. I said novel by accident there because that's how it reads like a thriller. But everyone asking them, we need this authority, we need that authority, opening the briefcase, rushing to wherever they need to go, in this case, to a helicopter, still getting people asking them, I need this now. Sir, what are you going to do? People thinking about their families as they have this timeline ticking down to Armageddon. But this is another one. Read another thing here. And this is about the president. The president now faces an inexorably small decision-making window of time. What must happen next has been rehearsed by everyone presently in attendance on satellite comms, except, most likely, the president himself, former Secretary of Defense Perry tells us. The president in this scenario, like almost all U.S. presidents since John F. Kennedy, is entirely underinformed about how to wage nuclear war when it happens. The president has no idea that as soon as he has been briefed on what is happening, he will have just 6 minutes to deliberate and decide which nuclear weapons to launch in response. 6 minutes. How is that even possible?
And we know that's possible because President Ronald Reagan wrote about it in his memoirs, saying that it is an irrational amount of time to have to decide to unleash Armageddon. And yet it exists. Again, making clear that ticking clock scenario.
I mean, it seems like that would be something that would be day one, week one, when you're president, or before you become president in the lead up to inauguration, to war game these things a little bit. We war game so many things at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels. It's inconceivable to me that the person who makes this kind of a decision hasn't been put through every single scenario they can possibly think of about who could launch, when they could launch, or detonate, maybe not even launch, maybe if you're talking about a super empowered individual or terrorist organization somehow. And we saw with North Korea how they built up theirs. We saw how a spy let the Soviet Union create theirs by 1949. So it's not inconceivable that there are multiple ways in which we could face some sort of a nuclear threat or a detonation attack of some sort. Inconceivable to me that in the lead up to inauguration, this new president is not put through these scenarios, briefed on any contingency, and can then ask questions and then be put through some of these more stressful encounters with a few second and third order effects thrown in, just in case he has to decide or in the future she has to decide what our future looks like, nuclear Armageddon or not. So that part really stood out to me.
When I interviewed former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta on exactly this subject, what he said was particularly illuminating because before he was SecDef, Panetta was director of the CIA. And before that, he was President Clinton's White House chief of staff. And to have someone like that confirm that most presidents in essence, don't want to know, or don't think they need to know, or are consumed with domestic issues, or are consumed with other kinds of foreign policy issues. That is astonishing to me for exactly the reasons you just delineated, and that as given your history, how everything is rehearsed by every person in the military chain of command, and yet the guy at the top isn't rehearsed. Wow.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. And even when you do that planning and you do those rehearsals and different things are thrown in to see how you react to them, going through each and every contingency you possibly can, when it happens for real, there's still things that you haven't anticipated because that's just the nature of life in general. But you have a foundation now upon which to make the best decision possible, literally under fire. I think a lot of people also think that we can just shoot down these weapons. There's like some sort of a shield or rockets or something. And we do have this SBX radar system that you discuss in the book, but that seems to be a fallacy about being able to shoot down, especially more than one, even one.
I mean, these different platforms that are designed to all work as a system to shoot down incoming missiles are mostly mysterious to most people. And of course, the war between, or rather the attack by Iran against Israel with short range and medium range ballistic missiles, and the success of the Iron Dome, shooting those down, and participation by an Aegis system belonging to the US Navy.
Mm,
In that matter has only exacerbated people's misconception that we could shoot down incoming missiles. And as I explain in the book, a long range ballistic missile is in a category of itself. We know, that is the missile that is traveling from one continent to the next. The shoot down rate on US interceptor missiles is 50%. And we know that from the Missile Defense Agency themselves. The spokesman, by the way, said it's like trying to shoot a bullet with a bullet. Think about that. And coupled with the fact that Russia, for example, has 640, changes a little every year, nuclear warheads on ready for launch status. That means they're deployed and ready to go.
yeah.
The United States has 44 interceptor missiles. Even with a 50% rate, you're not even taking into consideration the multiple warheads in some of the systems, the decoys. I get into that in Act 2 of the book. 44 interceptors up against 1,000 missiles. Just do the math.
Yeah. And I think people know this, but just to drive it home, the US president, as odd as this may seem, has sole authority to launch America's nuclear weapons. The president asks permission of no one, not the Secretary of Defense, not the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staffs, not Congress. In 2021, the Congressional Research Service published a review to confirm that the decision to launch nuclear weapons is the president's and the president's alone. The authority is inherent in his role as commander in chief, the research found. The president does not need the concurrence of either his or her military advisors or the US Congress in order to launch nuclear weapons. People know that, but when you put it out like that, it's like, oh, no advice from anyone. I mean, in the scenario, he's asking, but he doesn't have to.
He
That
doesn't
was,
have to. Jack,
no.
if you Google, does the president have sole authority? You will get like
Oh,
150,000,
wow.
responses that are along the lines was, well, not really.
Uh,
So the misconception is deep. And the true fact of the matter, and of course, everything I write and report in the book is footnoted in the back. So if readers have this question of like, wait a minute, I
mhm,
doubt that, or I'm wondering about that, they can find the source. And the source that we're talking about here is Congress itself, who released a report during the Trump administration stating absolutely the commander in chief has sole authority. He needs ask permission of no one.
yeah. And following what I read in the beginning of the book, this is essentially what happens next in this paragraph. When a nuclear bomb hits Washington, D.C., chaos will grip the nation. Without a functioning government, there will be no rule of law. Democracy will be replaced by anarchy. Moral constructs will disappear. Murder, mayhem, and madness will prevail. In the words of Nikita Khrushchev, the survivors will envy the dead. Wow.
And I'm going to add a point to that because in an interview I did with President Obama's 8-year-long FEMA director, FEMA is, of course, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, responsible for stepping in when that madness and mayhem and chaos initially takes over, as you just read. And when I interviewed Craig Fugate, he explained to me that there would be nothing FEMA could do because everyone would essentially be dead. There would be no population protection planning. And I asked him, you know, if that was really his quote. And he said yes. And not only that, he said that the only thing for anyone to do after this kind of a nuclear strike would be to self-survive, to hope that you stocked Pedialyte and that you shouldn't forget your morals.
That stood out to me too when I read that part about morals. That definitely stood out to me in here. I wish I had read this before I wrote my last book, because I sent my last book in and then I picked this up next and my final edits went in. I was so busy with that, and there's a nuclear scenario in there. And I wish I had
Mm.
read this beforehand, but also I was so glad that I got so much right through my own research. So as I was reading this, I was going along saying, oh, thank goodness, because people can pick this up and compare my
Yes.
thriller, total fiction, with this, a scenario. And I'm just so glad that I was pretty much on track. But I wish I'd read it ahead of time, because I think it would have sparked a couple other ideas or tweaks to a couple sentences in there. But I was so close, so that made me feel good. I would want to ask you about submarines before we go,
Mhm.
because they're such a significant part of this nuclear triad and what happens. And this right here, because it pointed out that a Soviet submarine can launch all of its missiles at roughly 5-second intervals, unloading all its missiles in about 80 seconds. And each missile has multiple warheads in its nose cone. This fire to strike time is so short that if the United States had an attack submarine trailing the Soviet ballistic missile submarine, it could not fire a torpedo in time to sink the submarine before it was empty of missiles.
They
Now,
do not call those nuclear armed, nuclear powered submarines handmaidens of the apocalypse for nothing. In the words of former nuclear subforce commander Admiral Connor, whom I interviewed, it's easier to find a grapefruit sized object in space than a nuclear armed submarine under the sea. And so, in the event that there is a nuclear strike from a submarine, there is nothing anyone can do to prevent that.
that part is incredible. And then North Korea specifically, it's so our efforts to contain the North Korea nuclear program from the Clinton administration to today seem like they were an utter failure, especially when compared to what Israel has done, and with our assistance sometimes, against the Iranian nuclear program. So as I was reading your book, I was thinking in my head about things that I've read about what the Israelis and with US intelligence support has done to derail, curtail, delay the Iranian nuclear program. And they seem almost at opposite ends of the spectrum. And I was wondering if that stood out to
Mm.
you as well.
Absolutely. I mean, the United States was consumed with the war on terror during, and meanwhile, the North Koreans were building up their nuclear arsenals, period. The CIA suggests that North Korea has 50 nuclear weapons, but some private NGOs put that figure at as high as 130. They have they're continuing to build nuclear platforms. They launch ICBMs to demonstrate power without announcing it to anyone. It's extremely dangerous what North Korea is doing. And the reason I chose North Korea as the instigating incident in nuclear war a scenario is an idea I got from Richard Garwin, the architect of the first thermonuclear bomb. In conversations I had with Garwin, and there were multiple, I asked him what he was most afraid of. And this is a man who has advised every president since Eisenhower. And he referenced a madman with a nuclear arsenal. He called it the Mad King scenario. And he even used the French term, après moi le déluge, which is just so haunting. After me, the flood. This idea that some mad king would really not care about the civilization, about the rest of the world, and do such an existentially ending act. And that is why I chose the scenario that I chose to begin the way it begins.
I think you'd used the French phrase at least twice in the book. And so I wanted to know the history. I looked it up, looked up the history,
Mhm.
and I started thinking about, oh, I need to incorporate this into a future thriller that I'm writing. As did your target set, by the way. I don't want to give up
Mm.
what those are right now. I want people to read this book, listen to this book. So I won't give that away, but you also inspired a couple thoughts as far as that stuff goes. I did not know that an ICBM launched at North Korea from the United States has to overfly Russia. That seems significant.
It is, well, in the words of Leon Panetta, it's a very dangerous hole.
Yeah.
So for listeners, just the real simple fact is that an ICBM, a US Minuteman ICBM, does not have enough range if it's targeting North Korea, to get there without overflying Russia. And so imagine with nuclear missiles flying, the idea that Russia would have to believe that these missiles coming at what it would almost certainly interpret at Russia, oh, no, no, they're just going over you. And that leads to disaster. And I ran that part of the scenario by a number of very knowledgeable people who confirmed with me that this is a very serious threat and a very serious concern,
Well, I hope
as it should be.
policymakers read this book. Policymakers read this book. Elected representatives read this book. Military leaders read this book and address that in particular. That seems like a glaring one that should be at the top of their lists, even before they figure out how to actually run a new president or sitting president through some of these scenarios. 1983's Proud Prophet War Game. Every scenario ending the same way. Declassified in 2012, and what I thought was fascinating about the declassification is that all the pages that I saw anyway are essentially all blacked out.
I did that on purpose, reprinting a copy of that declassified nuclear war game so that readers could see what a declassified nuclear war game looks like and have the same reaction you had and have the same reaction that I had, which is like, this isn't telling us anything, but it did tell us something. And that is because a civilian scientist at work on the Proud Prophet war game was then allowed to speak about the Proud Prophet war game in a general way without violating his security clearance. That is, Yale professor Paul Bracken, in his own book, he describes that no matter how a nuclear scenario begins, whether NATO's involved, whether China's involved or not, no matter how it begins, it ends in total nuclear Armageddon. He said everyone left the war game incredibly depressed. And
Yeah.
that we can learn a lot from.
Wow. And was that your main takeaway after writing this book, that every scenario ends the same way?
I did an interview with former STRATCOM commander General Keeler. And when discussing what the result might be if there were a nuclear exchange between Russia and the United States, what that results might be, General Keeler said to me, and he's quoted in the book, yes, the world could end in the next few hours. That is really powerful to think about, coming from the man in charge of the U.S. formerly in charge of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. And as I explained to readers in the book, the STRATCOM commander, in the event of a nuclear launch, is in direct communication with the President of the United States and takes the order to launch.
Incredible. And do you hope the citizens take away the same thing, readers, listeners, whether they're citizens going about their daily lives, voters, military leaders, elected representatives? What would the first thing, there's so many things in here. We talked about those gaps. We talked about the president not being prepared, completely read in to what's going on and what could possibly happen, what his options are, her options are in the future. What do you think should be at the top
Mhm.
of their list when it comes to impacting change through this
Mhm.
book? If they were to read this book, what do you think should rise to the top of their list to address first?
You know, I had this fascinating similar conversation last week with Newt Gingrich,
Oh,
Speaker
wow.
Gingrich of all people, who was an incredibly powerful person from the Reagan administration on. And he asked me, maybe your next book should be Nuclear War, a Solution. And in our discussion, what I said to him is what I will say here, which is that I am a journalist and a storyteller, and it's my job. What I wanted to do in this book is to demonstrate to readers in appalling detail just how horrific nuclear war would be. With that said, there are scores of groups that have been dedicating their work to a solution. And the most obvious one is a movement toward disarmament, certainly a movement away from proliferation. I think, as a little tiny ray of hope for listeners, maybe the story, and I talked this with Speaker Gingrich because of his camaraderie with President Reagan. The ray of hope, what can people do, comes from the idea of the Reagan reversal. Because in 1983, right around the same time as the Proud Prophet War Game, there was a ABC TV film called The Day After.
I remember.
And 100 million Americans watched it and were horrified. And they learned a lot of the same information that is in my book, meaning the end game is apocalypse. They were horrified by this, but so was President Reagan. And the impact of those two forces, the public's interest in this, the public's horror, and President Ronald Reagan's own greatly depressed was what he said he became after he saw The Day After. And it caused him to reach out to Gorbachev. Former enemy now becomes an adversary. This idea of, oh, we can work with someone. And the two world leaders met at Reykjavik. And as a result of their conversation, the world went from 70,000 nuclear weapons to the approximately 12,500 today. When you put that on balance with what's happening now, with the presidents and the leaders of nuclear armed nations not only not talking to one another, but outwardly threatening one another with the use of weapons of mass destruction, that is a dangerous thing. And I believe the people should really have a say in this, of like, you guys need to communicate.
Yep. And then you talk about the lack of communication and what it can lead to in the book. But thinking about The Day After, that's the power of popular culture. We've talked about it a couple times now. So the power of popular culture, what's being created, who that audience is, word of mouth that used to be at the water cooler at work, at family dinner tables, is now via digital mediums. But the power of popular culture, it still exists. And as we wrap up here, you've been so kind with your time. I always love talking to you. I could talk to you for days on end. I can only assume there's been Hollywood interest in this. And if you can't make any comments, that is totally fine. But I see this being fast-tracked into something at some point in the near future.
I am always asked to keep quiet on those issues, but I will tell
Understood.
you is that if you do read the newspaper, there was a very big article about the Dune director, Denis Villeneuve, and Legendary Film purchasing the book for a major film.
But we shall see, and I certainly hope
see.
that comes to fruition, because it'd be fantastic. And also another one that you probably can't answer, but when we sign off here, I want to ask you a question offline about it. Your next project. Do you have a list of projects that you're picking from as you go that you want to explore, or is there one that's do you rank them? I can only assume you have so many different ideas for your next project, and all your other books can only lead to more books and ideas and things you want to explore, I can imagine. Is there one that's near the top, or what are you doing next? Or probably
there is
now.
always, this is the hint. There is always a tiny morsel of the future book in the last book.
I love it. I love it. Right here, Nuclear War, a Scenario. Annie Jacobsen, thank you so much for spending so much time with me. Sincerely appreciate it. And hopefully we can link up soon. Anything else that I missed that you want to let people know about this book right here that's available right now and that every American should read? Not just American, everybody around the world should read this.
It's just an honor to be I think I'm your first guest on your new
You are?
podcast, the book club, the JACK CARR Book Club.
That's
So
right.
may I go down in history.
Fantastic.
Mm.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Congratulations. Thank you for writing such an important book. And hopefully I'll see you soon.
Can't wait for your new one.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you for joining Jack and Annie on the Jack Carr Book Club podcast. The August book of the month is Vince Flynn's Capture or Kill by Don Bentley. Make sure to like and subscribe to this channel and leave a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. Go to officialjackcarr.com to find out more, including where to add Jack Carr Book Club selections to your library for 15% off while supporting independent bookstores. And be sure to join Jack and fellow authors and readers at Jack Carr Book Club on Instagram.